In this demonstration, we are going to be looking at curved seams. And there are two different types of curved seams that we can be doing. There's sort of an inside or an outside curve. Depending on your definition, it can get a little confusing. So I like to refer to the curves in ways that we would be using them in the garment. So we have this particular curved seam, which would be more like a neckline or an arm's eye if you had to put a facing on it. So that's what that kind of curved seam is. Or there's the curved seam that we might see on a collar or a hem. So let's first focus on the curved seam for the neckline and the arm's eye. And that one is also can be referred to as a concave seam, curved seam. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we have our pattern here, and I will take a picture of the pattern so that you can have that as part of the demonstration in Canvas. But you can see the dimensions. I have also put them in here. The curve does not need to be a particular curve. You do not need to use this particular pattern. Any curved line will do. You just need to have a curve in there so that you have something to work with. And you do need to remember that this does not have any seam allowances added. So we're going to have to add seam allowance when we draw this. So you need two of these. And generally I'm starting with two pieces of muslin that are 8 inches by 5 inches. So you can see here, I've already marked it on this fabric. So here's my pattern and there's the fabric. And I went ahead and marked my 5/8 inch seam allowance. You could do as little as 1/2 inch, that would be fine. But then I also have to cut away all of this material. And so when you have that, then you're going to end up with something that looks like this. And I then went ahead and stitched my 2 layers together, back stitching from the front and the beginning, and trying to stay on the line as best as possible. You are stitching 2 layers together because we are trying to create this sort of faced curve that we would find along the neckline or arm side. And so now my next step is that I would go ahead and trim this down to 1/4 inch. So using my scissors, and again, you should just be able to eyeball this. You do not need to have it be exactly 1/4 inch. And so there, I've trimmed off my seam allowance. So now I have a nice shorter seam allowance. So I'm reducing the bulk when I go to flip this around. Now, when we're looking at these, we need to go ahead and clip this out because when this gets folded over, there's a lot of extra fabric and it's going to start to bunch up on itself. You can sort of see how it's starting to gather up. And so there are 2 ways in which we will reduce the bulk. One is to clip it, trim it, and then the other is to clip it. Now, when we are looking at these types, on this kind of curve, what we are doing is that when it comes inwards like this, it's actually going to be pulling the seam allowance open. So all we need to do is do small clips, and you can probably see here how that is sort of pressed. It's like splitting open. So all we need to do is take a pair of scissors and clip every, looks like 3/8 inch or so, and prep it for the flipping it over. So just using my scissors, I'm just going to clip directly in here. Now it's important that you clip to the seam, but not through, not through. And through the sort of biggest part of the curve, the sort of curviest part, you want to have more clips. But as you get to where it's starting to be a little bit more of a gentle slope and not quite so curved, you can have your clips come further apart. And again, always make sure you're not clipping through your seam allowance. So now when I pull this, you can see that it allows for the seam allowance to sort of split open. When I go to press this using my iron, I am going to press my seam allowance towards one direction, and then I'm going to flip it over. So using my iron, I am gently pulling the side away. And you don't want to press too far over your stitch line because you'll start to create little puckers in your fabric, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. So you can just press it to the one side. Usually I press it towards the facing side so that it causes it to roll just ever so slightly. Then now that I have that, I just flip it over and I'm going to press it again, making sure that my seam is laying right in between the two and that I can't see the seam on the right side of the garment. So I've now pressed that nice and flat. And now we have a beautiful curved seam trimmed and clipped and ready to go for our neckline or our arm side. So that is the one type. The second seam that we're going to be looking at, curved seam, is the type that I would use for maybe a hem, or it could be used for a collar. A lot of times this might, like a Peter Pan collar, would have this kind of curve. So this is very similar, except that we're going to clip it slightly different. So the first steps follow a similar pattern of what we saw in the previous one. You have your seam, your pattern here. My pattern, I started with a 8 by 5 inch piece of fabric, and I've basically just done a curve that goes along from one edge to the other edge. Again, this curve is not specific. You can use any curve, but I will provide this pattern on canvas for your sample if you would like to use it. When you once you draw this on here, you do need to draw your 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then you can trim away all the excess fabric because we don't need any of that. You're going to pin 2 layers together. You can see here I have 2 layers of muslin, and I am going to come in here and stitch this. Now remember, pin this so you're going to stitch along the line, and make sure you're pulling your pins out so that you are putting your pins in so you can pull them out easily as you're stitching. You're going to need to backstitch at the beginning and the end. So if we look at this one, you can see I trimmed away all the excess. I backstitched at the beginning and I backstitched at the end, and then we have a nice curved seam. So once we have this, now I'm going to trim this down just like we trimmed on the previous one. We're trimming this down to 1/4 inch. You can just eyeball this. You do not need to measure out an exact 1/4 inch. It just needs to be approximately 1/4 inch. So you can see I've now trimmed all that seam allowance away, and so I now have this. Now this one, instead of the seam allowance trying to splay apart, this one is going to overlap. And so when I do this type of curve, I need to actually cut out what I lovingly call carrots. So they look like the ends of little triangle carrots. So that is going to then allow it, when it's going through the thickest part of the curve, to sort of close together without the fabric overlapping itself. So how do I do the carrots? You could clip in and do one to the other side. That would be a little tedious, and it's also always putting a little bit of a risk because you might clip your seam. So a little cheater method is that you could fold this over, take your scissors, make sure that you are not going to cut through the seam. You are inside the seam allowance, and then you clip it and you create a little triangle. Now through the straighter part of the curve, just like I did on the previous one, I don't need to have my clips very close together because there isn't as much strain put on the seam allowance. But when I get to the part that's more curved, that's where the strain of the seam allowance is going to want to overlap. So then I'm going to start to put my clips a little bit closer. Remember, do not clip through your stitch line. If you clip through your stitch line, then you're going to have to go back in and sew over that stitch line and fix this broken stitch. So I am just going to keep going through my curve here. You can see this does not require it to be super close. If you had a very tight curve, almost circular, then you might need to make your carrots a little bit closer. So this one, you can see that through the bigger part of the curve, or the sharper part of the curve, I went ahead and put these a little bit closer together. But then as it straightens out here and here, they're further apart. And so that is now ready to be pressed and turned over. So just like I did on the previous one, I'm going to use my iron, and I'm going to press the seam allowance all to one side. So I press that to one direction, and then because it's hard to get in with the iron on both of them, I'm going to flip that around. And the curve is the hardest part, so I just do that as best as I can, and now it's ready to be turned over. So once I've got it turned over, I still need to press this flat. So when I go to press this, again, I want to make sure that my seam isn't being pressed over like that. I want my seam to be pressed right on the top, or just ever so slightly rolling to the facing side. And so I'm just going to sort of use my fingers to get that to lay right. And then I'm going to press it all nice and flat. And press the other side, the inside. And there is my bagged out faced curve that I would use for probably a hem or a collar. So those are our two curves. We have the curve seam that is for a collar or hem, and we also have our curve seam that we would use for a neckline or an arm side.